They called it a removal. A simple word, neat, bureaucratic, forgettable. But for the thousands of Native Americans forced to march west through mud, snow, and starvation, it wasn't a removal. It was an exodus, a death march, a crime hidden beneath the language of progress. The year was 1830. Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812, now sat in the White House. To his supporters, he was a symbol of the common man. To his enemies, he was a tyrant with a vendetta against anyone who stood in the way of white expansion. And to the native nations east of the Mississippi, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, he was the harbinger of something far worse. These nations had lived on their ancestral lands for centuries. They farmed, traded, built towns, and even established schools. The Cherokee printed newspapers in their own language. Their leaders drafted a constitution modeled after the United States itself. They did everything the federal government said they needed to do to be considered civilized, but none of it mattered. To white settlers, their land was the prize. Rich soil, rolling hills, and, as it turned out, gold. In 1828, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. The rush began, and the pressure to push the tribes out became unbearable. Jackson's allies in Congress moved quickly. The Indian Removal Act passed by a narrow margin in 1830. It gave the president authority to negotiate treaties that would relocate Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi. Lands they were told would be theirs forever. But forever, in the 19th century, rarely lasted more than a decade. The Cherokee resisted. Their leader, Chief John Ross, took their fight all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity, and the state of Georgia had no right to impose its laws on them. Legally, the Cherokee should have been protected. But when word of the decision reached President Jackson, he reportedly sneered, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The rule of law collapsed under the boots of expansion. Federal agents and soldiers began pressuring the Cherokee to sign removal treaties. Most refused, but a small faction, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Bowdoinett, believed resistance was futile. Without authorization from their nation's government, they signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, giving up all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for money and Western territory. Only a few hundred supported it. 17,000 opposed it. But in Washington, it didn't matter. Congress ratified the treaty by a single vote. And with that, the fate of an entire people was sealed. 2 years later, the army came. Families were rounded up at gunpoint, children torn from their homes, elders dragged from their beds. Soldiers forced them into makeshift stockades, disease-ridden pens where thousands would die before the march even began. Then came the long walk west, over 1,000 miles through freezing rain, swamps, and mountains. It began in the summer of 1838, under the command of General Winfield Scott. He claimed to act with compassion, ordering that the Cherokee be treated humanely. But the reality on the ground was chaos and cruelty. Soldiers burned homes, looted property, and shot those who resisted. Mothers gave birth on the roadside. The sick were left behind to die. They traveled in groups of 1,000, each led by detachments of soldiers. The path stretched from Georgia to Tennessee, across Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and finally into what was then called Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. The people called it Nunadal-Tsuni, the trail where they cried. And cry they did. Hunger stalked the march. Disease spread through every camp. Dysentery, pneumonia, measles. Winter storms froze men and horses alike. Some drank from tainted water just to survive another day. And when they buried their dead in shallow graves, they were forced to leave markers of stone so that others behind them wouldn't to walk over their bodies. Out of roughly 16,000 who began the journey, nearly 4,000 perished. Children, elders, entire families vanished into the mud and snow, forgotten by the very nation that promised to protect them. The Choctaw were the first to be removed. They lost so many that one leader described the journey as a trail of tears and death. The phrase would echo through history, Trail of Tears, becoming the single most haunting symbol of American betrayal. But it didn't end with the Cherokee. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole suffered their own forced migrations, each one marked by lies, starvation, and government indifference. The Seminoles fought back in the swamps of Florida, waging a brutal guerrilla war that cost thousands of lives. Yet even their defiance couldn't stop the tide of removal. The land they left behind was sold, settled, and cultivated. Cotton fields bloomed where villages once stood. White families built new lives on the ashes of nations. And for decades, textbooks would call it manifest destiny, as if genocide could be explained away by destiny. But to those who walked it, there was no destiny, only survival. Children watched their parents die in the snow. Mothers carried infants who would never see their first spring. And elders whispered prayers to spirits they hoped would guide them home, even though home no longer existed. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. It revealed how easily the ideals of freedom and equality could be twisted when they stood in the way of greed. It showed how America's promise of liberty had a shadow cast over the bodies of those who were never meant to share in it. And in that shadow, something broke. A trust that would never be repaired. Even after the journey ended, the suffering didn't. The Indian Territory they reached was barren, unfamiliar, and already being encroached upon by settlers and railroads. The government had promised supplies and protection. Most never came, yet somehow they rebuilt. They planted new crops, raised schools, re-established councils. They kept their language alive, their stories intact. Because survival, even in the face of annihilation, was resistance. The Trail of Tears became more than a road of death. It became a scar, a permanent reminder carved into the nation's conscience. And the question that still echoes, centuries later, I see just how it happened, but how a nation built on liberty could justify turning that liberty into chains. The story didn't end when the Cherokee reached Indian Territory. For many, that was where the suffering truly began. Imagine arriving in a strange land after months of death and exhaustion. The trees looked different, the soil was unfamiliar, and the rivers flowed in strange directions. The people had lost everything, their homes, their crops, their sacred sites, even their dead, buried in shallow, unmarked graves along the endless path behind them. The government had promised new beginnings. Permanent land, they called it, a sanctuary where native nations could rebuild without interference. But the ink on those promises had barely dried before they began to crumble. The soil was rocky and poor for farming. Disease swept through the new settlements. And the supplies promised by Washington, food, tools, livestock, arrived late or not at all. Those who had survived the march now faced starvation. Many of the elders, weakened by the journey, didn't last through the first winter. Families scavenged for roots and bark. Children, already thin as shadows, wasted away in silence. The U.S. government's Indian agents reported the devastation in dry bureaucratic language. Insufficient rations, poor conditions, high mortality. But those words couldn't capture what it felt like to watch a world collapse while the nation responsible turned its gaze elsewhere. The land that was meant to be theirs forever was already under threat. White settlers and land speculators soon began pressing westward again, claiming that Indian Territory was too valuable to be left to native nations. Railroads followed, treaties were broken, and with each new decade, forever shrank smaller and smaller. The people who had once lived in the green valleys of Georgia and the Carolinas were now hemmed in by boundaries they hadn't to drawn, in a place where even the sky seemed alien. Yet they refused to vanish. In the face of all they had endured, the Cherokee and other displaced nations began to rebuild their societies from the ground up. They established schools, churches, and newspapers once more. They elected leaders, re-established councils, and wrote laws. In a remarkable act of endurance, the Cherokee Constitution of 1839 declared their right to self-governance, education, and justice, as if to say, "You can take our land, but you cannot erase us." But the wound ran deep. Within the Cherokee Nation, bitterness festered over the Treaty of New Echota, the unauthorized agreement that had sealed their fate. Many held the Ridge family responsible for the death march, believing they had betrayed their people. In 1839, vengeance arrived. Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Bowdenet were assassinated by fellow Cherokees. The blood of division spilled into the new homeland, proving that even across 1,000 miles, the ghosts of the trail still walked beside them. The trauma of removal didn't just break bodies, it fractured identities. Children grew up never knowing the forests their ancestors once called home. Stories of the old lands became legends, told around fires by those who had survived the march. Memory itself became a form of resistance. Meanwhile, in Washington, the policymakers who had orchestrated removal congratulated themselves. Andrew Jackson called the policy a benevolent act, claiming it had saved native peoples from extinction. His supporters hailed it as progress, a triumph of civilization over wilderness. But for every tribe displaced, the truth became harder to bury. Reports trickled out describing the deaths, the diseases, the cruelty. Missionaries who had accompanied the caravans wrote letters home, describing the frozen bodies left along the road. Soldiers confessed to atrocities they could never forget. Even some members of Congress began to question whether the cost of progress had gone too far. Yet the machinery of expansion didn't stop. After the Cherokee came the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole. Each removal followed the same cruel rhythm: promises, treaties, betrayal, and death. And as more tribes were forced west, the United States grew stronger, wealthier, and more certain of its divine right to rule from ocean to ocean. The Trail of Tears, in the end, wasn't a single road. It was a system, a policy of displacement disguised as destiny. And every time the government pushed a boundary westward, another trail began. But what makes the story truly haunting isn't just the suffering of those years. It's how easily the nation learned to forget. By the mid-1800s, the removal era was already fading from public memory. Newspapers called the frontier tamed. Textbooks described Native Americans as a vanishing race. The violence was rewritten as progress, the suffering repackaged as inevitability. Even school children learned the myth that the pioneers had simply settled the land as though it had been empty all along. But it wasn't empty. It was full of people, of stories, of nations whose roots reached back before the first European ever saw the continent. The Trail of Tears wasn't a sad footnote. It was the foundation on which modern America was built, a foundation of broken treaties, stolen land, and blood. And in the quiet corners of Indian Territory, where the wind carried the whispers of the dead, those who remained never forgot. They passed down songs of mourning, low, slow laments that told of the homes left behind, the loved ones lost, the miles walked with bleeding feet. Every child who grew up hearing those songs carried the memory forward. Memory became heritage. Heritage became strength. Through that strength, Native identity endured where empires had expected it to disappear. And that endurance carried a message, one that still speaks through time. You cannot erase a people by moving them on a map. In the decades that followed, the United States would continue to break promises. The Civil War would come, dividing even those already torn apart by removal. And later, the federal government would impose boarding schools, forced conversions, and new forms of cultural genocide. But through all of it, the spirit that survived the Trail of Tears refused to die. Because what the government couldn't understand, what it still struggles to understand, is that survival itself can be defiance. The descendants of those who walked the trail carry that defiance in their blood. Every language lesson revived, every ceremony performed, every child taught the truth of what happened. It all pushes back against the lie that their suffering was necessary. The Trail of Tears isn't just history. It is a mirror, one that reflects the nation as contradictions. Freedom built on removal, democracy born from exclusion, progress stained with grief. And as long as that mirror exists, America must decide whether to look away or finally face its reflection. The years passed, but the shadow of the trail never lifted. Every nation that had been forced west, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and others, found themselves living not in the promised land they were told of, but in a landscape of control and constant intrusion. The ink on the treaties meant nothing. By the 1850s, white settlers were already pushing into Indian territory, demanding access to gold, fertile land, and railroads. The government's agents, instead of defending the treaties, often worked quietly with speculators. Corruption flourished, and the same bureaucratic machine that had organized removal began organizing theft all over again. The irony was unbearable. The people who had been marched hundreds of miles under armed guard, supposedly to secure them peace and independence, were now being told that their new homeland was once again needed for America's destiny. It was clear the promise of forever was a lie. For the Cherokee Nation, rebuilding became an act of rebellion. They founded schools like the Cherokee male and female seminaries, which rivaled some Eastern colleges in quality. They printed newspapers in both Cherokee and English. Their capital, Tahlequah, became a symbol of pride, a living statement that even after everything, their culture endured. But the pain lingered in the everyday lives of survivors and their descendants. Mothers still told their children stories about the long walk, about loved ones left behind, about snow that fell like silence over the dead. Those stories weren't told to dwell in sorrow. They were warnings, reminders of what happens when power decides a people's fate. Then came the Civil War, and with it, another cruel test. Indian territory was caught between the Union and the Confederacy, and both sides sought alliances with the displaced tribes. For the Cherokee, it tore open old wounds. Some leaders sided with the Union, others with the Confederacy. Old divisions between those who had signed the removal treaty and those who had resisted resurfaced. Brother once again fought brother. The war brought devastation to their lands. Homes were burned, crops destroyed, families displaced once more. When the war ended, the federal government punished the tribes that had sided with the South by seizing even more of their territory. For the Cherokee and others, it was removal all over again, not on foot this time, but on paper. And yet, even as land was stripped away, something remarkable happened. The stories began to transform. Memory became movement. The descendants of the Trail of Tears survivors began turning remembrance into resilience. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Native leaders began organizing to protect what remained: their lands, their rights, their languages. They understood something crucial, that survival wasn't just about living, it was about being heard. They petitioned Congress. They built new alliances. They published histories and testimonies that countered the myths of benevolent removal. Slowly, the truth began to seep into public consciousness that the Trail of Tears wasn't an unfortunate necessity, but an act of deliberate cruelty carried out in the name of expansion. Still, the United States continued its policies of assimilation. Native children were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages, wear traditional clothes, or practice their faith. teachers told them that their ancestors' suffering had been for their own good. It was removal by another name, the erasure of identity instead of the erasure of land. But resistance lived in quiet acts of defiance. Children whispered their native words at night under blankets. Elders told stories in secret. Families passed on songs that remembered the path of exile, songs that no government could silence. By the 20th century, Native activists began reclaiming those memories openly. They demanded recognition of the Trail of Tears, not as a sad chapter, but as a crime, a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing justified through law and faith. And as America entered the age of civil rights, the story of the trail found new meaning. The same nation that once forced people from their homes under the banner of civilization now had to confront the hypocrisy of preaching equality while ignoring its oldest injustice. For the Cherokee Nation, commemoration became power. Annual remembrance walks retraced portions of the original trail. Monuments were raised not for pity, but for pride, to honor those who had endured when everything was taken. In 1987, the U.S. Congress officially designated the Trail of Tears as a National Historic Trail, stretching over 5,000 miles across 9 states. It was an acknowledgement, late and imperfect, but meaningful. Yet even that recognition couldn't erase the centuries of silence that had come before. Because the truth is, the trail never really ended. It continued through every policy that sought to erase Native identity, through broken treaties, stolen children, poisoned lands, and cultural suppression. The path wound through generations, changing shape but never disappearing. And still, the people walked it, not in chains anymore, but in remembrance. Modern descendants of those survivors now tell their ancestors' stories in classrooms, documentaries, and museums. They teach languages once banned. They restore ceremonies once outlawed. Each word spoken, each drumbeat sounded, is a defiance against the erasure that the trail once tried to complete. But remembering is not enough. The deeper truth of the Trail of Tears lies in what it reveals about America itself. This was not the story of a distant, barbaric past. It was the story of a nation that built its democracy on displacement, that preached liberty while denying it to the first peoples of its land. It's a reminder that cruelty can wear the mask of law, and that progress often hides its victims behind pretty words. Every generation must decide how to face that truth. To remember the Trail of Tears is not to dwell in guilt. It is to understand the cost of forgetting. Because when a nation forgets the suffering it was built upon, it risks repeating it in new forms. The Trail's lesson is as relevant now as it was in 1838. The same greed that drove men to seize Cherokee lands now drives corporations to seize native resources. The same rhetoric of civilization that justified removal now echoes in debates about who deserves to belong. The same silence that followed the march still lingers in history books that tell half-truths. And yet, the people endure. In modern Cherokee communities, you can still hear the language spoken, see the crafts practiced, and feel the pride of a people who refused to vanish. Their identity is not defined by what was taken from them, but by what they kept alive against all odds. Every child who learns the truth of the trail becomes part of that survival. Every person who walks the marked paths or reads the old letters bears witness to history that refuses to die. The Trail of Tears isn't only a scar. It is a living testament to resilience. It tells us that even in humanity's darkest acts, there exists a light that cannot be extinguished. The story began with displacement. It ends, if it ends at all, with endurance. And perhaps that's the truest measure of justice. Not that the suffering can ever be undone, but that those who suffered were never truly defeated. They walked through the fire, across rivers, over mountains, through snow and disease and death, and somehow they kept walking. Their footsteps echo still, not as cries of despair, but as the sound of a people who refused to disappear.